questions during the lecture, type them into the chat, and Eric and I will work as your gophers, and we'll bring questions up.
You're recording.
Great. All right. My name is Puck Curtis, and I'm here with my co-host Eric Myers, and we are the founders and directors of the Sacramento Sword School. Tonight we have with us Michael Heveran, who has been a student of swordsmanship for 20 years, training primarily in pre-modern Italian, Spanish, and Japanese traditions. For the past 5 years, he's been coaching practice groups for Fabrisian and Bolognese swordsmanship in Seattle. He has lectured on the intersection of history and martial arts for the Vancouver International Swordplay Symposium, for which he has also served as a board member. Past projects have included a historical survey of Italian swordsmanship, a visual guide to the evasive techniques of 17th century Italy, and a lecture on the use and abuse of historical narratives for martial artists. He also hosts a weekly reading and discussion group to help students dive deeply into historical martial arts texts. This lecture is going to explore the connections in footwork and tactics between the swordsmanship of Girard Thibault and Salvator Fabris. We will discuss the 3 tactical modes of Fabrisian swordsmanship and how those distinctions can help us better understand Thibault's system. And as a personal note, I just would like to say that Michael is one of the people who has always been great about fearlessly giving me critical feedback in a way that has always been quite positive. So I really treasure his ability to contribute to what we do, and he's just an all-around good guy. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Puck. And thanks for having me. Let's get started. So as Puck said, we'll be talking about the swordsmanship of Girard Thibault and Salvator Fabris. Specifically, we're going to be mostly talking about footwork, but we're going to be using the footwork as a launching point to talk about almost everything in a sense. I want to talk about how Fabris helps me understand Thibault. That's a big part of what I'm here to say. But I do want to get a little bit of the basics. I want to set a little bit of a foundation first, because we might not all fully be familiar with Thibault and Fabris. Thibault, if you've seen Matthew Houghton's second lecture in this same series, you can get a little bit of a baseline. I'm going to assume that some people here have seen that, and if not, if you're watching the recording later, I encourage you to go check that one out. So Thibault's Dutch. He published in 1630, but he actually died the year before. He spent time in Spain, so and because of the nature of his art, how he talks about it and his Spanish connection, we often consider him a non-orthodox member of the Destreza tradition. So he's interesting in that respect. He's practicing something Destreza adjacent, if not Destreza itself, which makes him somewhat related to the broader family and yet somewhat standalone. This isn't going to be a general introduction for Thibault, but a couple of things that make him noteworthy that are worth mentioning. He's got a unique grip. He's got very upright stances. He's got very natural movement. And if you add these things together, he starts to look distinctive. Maybe less distinctive compared to the Spanish, but still a little distinctive compared to them. Now, Salvator Fabris, he is, on the face of it, doing something very different. He's from Padua, which is in Italy. He wrote in 1606. But though he's from Italy and though he writes in Italian, he spent most of his career in Denmark, in Copenhagen, because he served at the royal court of the King of Denmark. You know, like Hamlet's ghost dad, that guy. What I'm saying is that, well, really, you can't rule out that Fabris wasn't involved in a classic ghost dad situation. Anyway, he's probably the most influential 17th century Italian author. And if you set aside Pacheco, he might be the most famous European swordsman of the 17th century. I think Pacheco edges him out there. So what's he known for? Well, if you look at his images, you'll see it right away. He's known for really strongly forward inclined guards. He's known for the dramatic voids, both low voids and twisting voids. And he's known for a tactic called proceeding with resolution, in which he approaches his opponent constantly without stopping. So these two guys, they don't really sound like each other. I mean, they're similar time period, but it really raises the question, why would we even compare them to begin with? So the reason why we might compare them is that they're both ambitious system builders. They're not putting together grab bags of techniques, right? They're trying to come up with a systematic approach to fighting that has a lot of different answers to a lot of different problems. They're fairly self-contained, which means they stand alone. So you can look at, for example, Thibault's art, and you can read within cover to cover. Hopefully, that's, if you believe Thibault, that's enough to understand his art. It's not fragmentary in any way, but you could still supplement it by looking at the other Destreza arts, which is really, really nice. Same with Fabris, where he writes a very long and detailed book, and it does stand alone, but you can also supplement by looking at a lot of different Italian sources. And what's really nice about both of them is they both have a very large amount of text and a very large amount of detailed images. So they're very thoroughly documented. So similar period, well documented, both systematic, and they're both related, if somewhat distantly, to a number of other familial sources that we can draw upon. That puts us in a pretty good position to know what we're talking about. Also, they use essentially the same weapon. So I use literally the same practice sword for both arts. I think, now it's a little bit debatable. Thibault gives us really specific measurements, but Fabris doesn't. That being said, I think the same measurements work for both in terms of blade. Same dimensions roughly, at least within, it's within an acceptable bounds. The main difference is that Thibault requires that your hilt does not have a knuckle bow. Fabris doesn't care. Okay, so if you don't have knuckle bow, same weapon pretty much works for both. And I think that helps because it helps us set aside some potential complicating factors, or lets us isolate some things. That I should add a caveat. Fabris will often use a dagger. Sometimes he uses a cloak. He'll make references to other offhand weapons. Thibault's not about that life. He wants one weapon. Finally, if you're interested in Thibault, and so this is a Destreza series, so it makes sense to compare him to someone famous. So likely that's going to be Pacheco or Fabris in his time period. By the way, most of the references, if you track down all the name tracks of Fabris, most of them are about how well known he is, which is kind of funny. He's famous for being famous. I should also mention that Thibault makes the comparison himself. Let me show you something. This is a still from chapter 33, the final chapter of his first book. It says at the top, against the postures of Salvator Fabris. In this, he spells it without the S, Salvator Fabri. So that is so Thibault actually does Fabris the rare honor of giving him an entire chapter in his magnum opus, which is almost unheard of. So Thibault himself thought it was worth making the comparison. We won't be dissecting that chapter today, by the way. But if there's interest in another lecture, we've spoken about the possibility of doing a second one where we talk about that or something similar. And I could take it through play by play if there's interest, see if maybe Thibault was fair. But the main reason to compare these guys is that, well, biographically, I've got experience with both. And I can just tell you that Fabris has helped me understand Thibault. And that's the reason that we're here today. And I might as well give you the long and short of it up top. These two arts seem very different on the face of it. Fabrisian swordsmanship. By the way, you'll sometimes hear me say the word Fabrisian. That's kind of like a cheeky modern term. It's like Descartes and Cartesian. I like to say Fabrisian because Fabris is the founder of a sub-tradition. A lot of people don't know, it's not just Fabris. He was followed by quite a few people, particularly in the German-speaking parts of Europe. So as I mentioned, Fabris taught in Denmark. Well, his influence spread probably radially out from that area. Those are largely German-speaking areas. So there are a lot of books that follow Fabris from his students or his students' students that very much are in keeping with his tradition. And then, of course, the actual Italians who are like Capoferro, Gigante Alfieri, guys like that. So if you look at guys like Heusler and Schoeffer, are the anonymous authors of the Paulus Armata or the C13. These guys are either Fabrisian outright by lineage, or they're influenced by Salvator Fabris's book. So this is what I mean when I say Fabrisian swordsmanship is primarily Fabris, but also his followers. So Fabrisian swordsmanship really has some useful distinctions that help me understand Thibault's art. And in particular, there's one, which is that, and this is common in other types of Italian swordsmanship as well, but Fabris forces us to understand two modes of fighting. There's a firm-footed mode, or a pia fermo mode, and a passing mode. Firm-footed and passing. They represent two different attitudes towards momentum, is how you could summarize that. Now, Fabris uses both. Now, the passing mode is extremely similar to what Thibault wants to do. The firm-footed mode is almost entirely absent from Thibault's art. And I'm going to borrow this Italian distinction to help explain how Thibault fits in with the greater world of swordsmanship. So let's talk about what it means to fight firm-footed, or pia fermo, what it means to fight on the pass, and what the implications of each one are. First, we should talk about, how does Thibault like to move? You may have an idea already. So if you've got a Destreza background, a lot of what he wants to do is not that surprising. It's maybe a little different, but not hugely different. Although, I should say, it's going to depend on your interpretation, because there are, of course, many interpretations of Destreza out there. But Thibault likes a short, natural stance. So let's start by talking about that. He has, well, first of all, why don't we take a look at what his preferred guard looks like. This is the guard of the right angle posture of the straight line. Why is it not coming up here? Okay, let me bring it up. Just give me a second here. How about this? Okay, this is the guard of the right angle posture of the straight line. So you see Thibault here, it has his feet pretty close together. His body is quite profiled. He's relaxed. His feet are at an acute angle to each other. He's highly profiled. He's quite neutral. So let's think about, in many ways, this is not uncommon for Destreza. There are some particular details, like the fact that his front foot is not pointed. Now, let's talk about what this is good for. I mean, his feet are close together. That makes it easy to move either foot. His center is high. That means it's good for turning his body quite quickly. This is very relaxed. It's what the body's naturally good at. It's good at profiling completely. In fact, I would argue that if you took this exact same stance, but then turned your front foot 90 degrees, which is a little bit more orthodox Destreza-like, you would profile a little bit less. You'd be a little bit more square. So this is a little bit more profiled. This is good for ordinary walking. It's good for moving in any direction. Now, nothing comes for free, though, because there are some things this is bad for. So it's high center. While it is good for turning, it's bad for stability, right? Which means that generally speaking, if you're going to take force or apply force, first thing you got to do is move, right? You can't really just take force where you're standing, or if you do, you've got to be doing so against an unstable opponent. If you shift your weight in a position like this, well, it's not going to allow you to meaningfully angle your body when you do so. So if you have your very long stance, for example, shifting your weight forward and backward lets you re-angle your hips, re-angle your upper body, and it has a strong effect, but not so much here. Likewise, if he can move in any direction, that also means he's not primed to move in any particular direction, right? So that's a trade-off, very normal trade-off. I would also say that the fact that you're relaxed is not in and of itself a good thing. So Thibault likes to say, take a couple steps towards me and stop. You're in a stance, right? So that's true. You know, it's very relaxed. But the thing is that a lot of us, when we're just walking around at a lower level of attention and alertness, we are using our bad habits, our daily bad habits, right? We have bad posture, we have maybe pronated feet, we have any number of problems. And when we adopt a less natural guard, we actually correct a lot of those because that is our cue to do so. So if you're very relaxed, you may actually not be cueing your body to enter into a higher state of alertness. So relaxation is good, don't get me wrong, but it has a drawback. I should also mention that stance like this, not too great at stepping out and leaving one foot behind. Right, so if you want to spread out your feet and keep them that way, it's not ideal for that. But largely speaking, Thibault is very happy with all these trade-offs, right? They come with good and bad. He's not making sacrifices without payoff. So that's his stance. That's just the static version. And we can see it's somewhat of a study of neutrality, readiness, that sort of thing. Let's talk about in motion, though, because in motion, I think this gets a little bit more interesting because I think a lot of people, they start reading Thibault's book and they don't really get past, say, the first 2 chapters or so because, well, if you read it, you know, it's not an easy book to read. And the first few chapters, maybe the first 4 or so, are very static-minded, right? But most of the book isn't. So sometimes when people only flip through his book, they don't really understand how do you get this sort of fighting out of this highly static, neutral mentality. And the truth is that he's not staying there. So he's going to pass his feet, for example, on most steps. That's not surprising. But he's also, when he passes, he's going to go from that neutral weighted position and then onto one foot or the other. So if we take a look at this, this is an example of Thibault's, this is his chapter 30, and I'm just going to zoom in right here. Okay, so this man on the right, he's our hero. This is Alexander, okay? This is Zachary. So we're going to read this from right to left, as in across the bottom, right to left. Alexander here, you can see the first thing you'll notice about his stance is that it is forward weighted and wide, and yet it is in Thibault's book. In fact, Thibault's book is full of this stuff. And you'll also notice that in the next circle here, Alexander's foot has passed one foot beyond the other in sort of a compassing, turning mode. And then immediately afterwards, he's going to untwist while coming forward and strike. And then he's going to come back to the opponent's blade. Zoom out here for a second so we can see the whole sequence. This is one of, I essentially chose this sequence at random. There's many of them. Well, actually, I chose it because it's easy to follow it on screen, but there's a million of these. It's a very thoroughly illustrated book. This is a good example of how he's passing on most steps. It's maybe not super obvious, but he's also usually stepping diagonally left or right. He's usually reangulating his body. In that sense, seems fairly typical of Destreza, according to what I know of Destreza. That also means that compared to Italians like Fabris, he's often taking a few extra steps to reach his opponent. And part of that is because he is sometimes he's a little unwilling to leave his opponent's blade. So he's a little willing to chase it around a little bit. Also, it's worth mentioning that Thibault doesn't usually leave his rear foot planted behind him, right? So he's not usually taking a big step with one foot behind. I mean, he will, but it's maybe not his de facto way of operating.
Michael, I have a question if you have a moment.
Sure.
I'm looking at that step, which I would liken to a Girard or an inquartata type step, where he's passing the rear foot back, crossing. And that is a little unusual for Destreza. Have you seen that in other places? Can you comment on that?
It is unusual for Destreza. It's quite normal for Thibault. He'll do that in all over the place, and even with the other foot. But the other foot, he's doing it during a quote-unquote movement of conclusion. So take that with a grain of salt. Thibault has this greater willingness to walk backwards a little bit. That's maybe a mischaracterization. The idea of he's a lot more willing to step diagonally to his right, leading, even if he's gaining ground on his opponent, he's much more willing to step with his rear foot first. So, which is kind of non-Pachachistan, right? Because Pacheco, I'm fairly certain, would always do that with the right foot first, which is going to avoid that cross. So I think just on the face of it, Pacheco just wouldn't do this, or at least not very often, and probably only at the very end of an action. I don't, but to my knowledge, this is not particularly normal. I mean, in this specific case, maybe Pacheco would be fine with it, but the degree to which Thibault does it, you're right, is unusual for Destreza. It actually looks more Italian. Although the Italians would actually use it in a very different tactical context, almost always as the strike itself, right? So if we looked at this, you see that Thibault is actually not striking on this. In this case, he's approaching what he calls an unnatural posture, something more like a Bolognese corolonga e alta or something, and he is attempting to keep his distance from it and stay behind his hilt. But
So
keep in mind...
sorry. We just have to interrupt each other a little bit because of the lag. We have a question. Someone's curious if this may show up in Dutch dance and not Spanish, so perhaps it's a more natural action for them.
You know, I don't know. I don't know anything about dance, but I'll say this. From a swordsmanship perspective, it feels very natural to me if I just have the mentality of wanting to point my shoulders where my hilt is going. Right, because if you don't do this, it's actually harder to stay profiled at all angles. So one thing that, I'll take your interpretation of Destreza as an example. I see from you guys a lot of times doing this. So reaching across your chest a little bit. And so Thibault's not very willing to do that, right? So he'll do that a little bit, but he generally doesn't like to reach across his own chest. Instead, if he's going to place his hilt there, he'd much rather turn his shoulders more to get there. And he's actually more hardcore about this than a lot of Destreza guys are. And that's one of the reasons why you might turn the body. Because if you're already profiled, as he starts profiled, and then you need to turn more to the left, well, you end up crossed up. He's okay with that. But I will say that generally speaking, he moves in a way that ballroom dancers would be happy with.
Thanks. That does make sense. Yes.
In fact, that's one of the next. That is literally the next point on my outline, because one of the things I wanted to point out was that he's twisty, right? But he's twisty in a way that keeps his upper body in a consistent frame, which is actually something that a ballroom dancer, particularly leads, are really good about, is turning their body without compromising what's happening above the hips, which means that the turn is originating with the feet. Compare that with what Salvator Fabris is doing, where he's turning his body. Fabris is constantly turning and twisting, but he's doing so often without moving his feet substantially. So he's often twisting, reorganizing his body in interesting ways. Thibault is mostly just moving his feet. Weight management for Thibault is also quite important. We started out by saying that he's big on a neutral stance. So take a look at this footprint. We can see that he even gives us footprints on the ground to show us his preferred stance. And we saw that a little bit earlier. Thibault wants us to start with our weight even, but once we get moving, if you recall, his weight is almost never shown even. And it's not as if he's returning to neutral in between. No, he's going straight into the next step. So he's often completely weighting one foot, then completely weighting the other foot, back and forth, back and forth. So that is an important characteristic of what he's doing. It's not necessarily unique, but it is important for what we have to talk about today. Here's something that is a little more unique, though, although not unheard of. He's got a distinctive way of pausing. You may have seen this. He likes to raise a foot pause with his foot in the air, and then finish by setting it down. So he's slicing time so that there's two separate motions there, the foot rising and then the foot falling. And he'll add a decision point there. And then finally, another interesting way that he moves, he'll sometimes switch his weight quickly in ways that just aren't possible when his feet are far apart. So like he'll cast his shoulders forward and then quickly switch which foot is forward. That's not like a common technique for him as far as I could tell, but it is something that is just not available in certain stances, particularly long stances. So that's waiting. Let's talk about striking. Thibault will once again widen his stance to strike. So he's not just widening during some of his approach, he's also widening to strike, as you might expect. He needs power, he needs stability, that's normal. It's not too often that you see people actually strike with their feet close together. Here's a fun thing he does. He does something called executing with rigor, which you'll know about if you read, watched or listened to Matthew Howden's second lecture, but it's fun enough that let's talk about it anyway. Executing with rigor, here's an example. So in the foreground, we've got two circles here, one in the foreground, one in the background. So in the foreground, we have a point going into Zachary's head. And in the background, we have execution with rigor, which is stepping with that point as far as Alexander can go. Alexander, the protagonist. Here's another example of the same thing. Let's see. I've got another one here. I mean, there's a million examples, but I just pulled two. How about this one? Same basic idea. Foreground, point goes in. Background, point goes in far. Keep in mind, if the opponent's sword wasn't there, he would be putting his hilt entirely on Zachary's body. In this case, he's just going until he can't go anymore. This is actually a really cool way of, well, it's brutal, but it's a cool way of pinning the opponent's sword to their body to prevent the after thrust, as the Germans would call it. It also, in Thibault's words, helps eliminate the possibility of revenge. From a footwork perspective, that's interesting, though, because he wants to thrust deeply, but he's not necessarily willing to do it in a single step. Finally, I should mention about striking is that Thibault will often step around someone. He'll orbit them a little bit. He will step to their side, or even in some cases behind them if he's allowed to. That's something I think a lot of us, it's sort of implied, a lot of us would do if given the chance, but we are often not given it explicitly. So here's an example that Alexander is here on the right. Once again, we're reading this right to left. Alexander here on the right is going to approach Zachary. Here's Zachary with a sword and a dagger. He's going to do that little girata step. So here's our second movement. Then he's going to get to Zachary's side, and then he's actually going to end up behind Zachary. This is a very common sort of thing for Thibault if you allow him to do it. He is very happy to do so. He'll often cut. In this case, he's cutting to Zachary's head. By the way, if you didn't know, Thibault cuts all the time. He's maybe not as as brutal about his cuts as he is about his thrusts, though. So now we've got a rough.
Sorry, I do have another question. So the Girarda stepping that we're seeing, it's fascinating, and it does. I can see like this link to what you're talking about with Fabris, but that middle step where you're poised in the Girarda, we've seen examples where he's flowing forward with that, but I would expect that there's a need to be able to bail out of that and change directions quickly. What is the escape from that position?
Is to continue moving forward, but then to change directions. So in a position like that, and I'll bring it up again, in a position like this, and this is true for Fabris as well, if you're in this sort of position, and this is actually extremely, this one's maybe not the best example because his shoulders are still basically over his hips, which are still basically over his feet. So maybe in this case, he could bail out. But in a lot of cases, when this isn't true, he has to keep going forward, but he doesn't necessarily have to keep going in the same direction. So a lot of times as you come forward, you start a girata, you can still kind of split either diagonal, but you still have to keep going. That's generally how it works. And most people, when they object to something like a girata, it's because it's unstable. But in this case, that instability is forward. But yeah, I mean, that's a one thing. This lecture is going to give you the language to explain why Thibault doesn't care. Essentially, that's what we're going to get to. So we now have a rough idea of how Thibault wants to move. That was just a general introduction to his movement. Now we need to look at Fabris. And unfortunately, this one's going to take a little while, just because the way that Fabris wants to move is actually fairly complex. So let's talk about it. How does Fabris want to move? Well, the number one thing we need to know is that he's got more than one mode, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about. But I guess we should start with a stance, shouldn't we? If you're familiar with his book, he has 20 guard plates, and that's just in the single sword section. Then there's a sword and dagger section. Then there's a sword and cloak section. Oh, you gotta love it. Okay, so here's an example of a Fabrisian stance. You haven't seen one, congratulations. This is the day you get to learn about Fabrisian stances. They are short, they are back-weighted. By the way, the fact they're back-weighted is, that's a universal trait of 17th century Italians. It is basically 99% consensus on that, but not to this degree, right? You see his hip is actually behind his rear heel, right? So hip behind the heel, shoulders, in this case, this is guardia seconda, but shoulder in this case ahead of the hip. You see how they're counterbalancing over the center of mass, which is, about here. Arms similarly extended as Thibault, but in a different grip. The feet are wider than Thibault, but that's actually variable for Fabris. He likes short stances, but not the same degree of shortness all the time. He likes forward inclined bodies most of the time, and the degree of profile that he uses is quite variable. This is a pretty square stance, but that's going to depend. So, because there are a variety of acceptable stances in Fabris's system. That was guardia seconda, but the more that so guardia seconda, if I'm looking at the camera, it's fairly square. Terza a little less so. Quarta quite profiled. Prima on the other way actually might even be a little past square, starting to profile in the other direction. Depending on how you read it, of course. There are people who disagree on these things. But suppose we were to look at Fabris's guardia quarta. Why don't we look? Well, one of them. He's got several. So why don't we look at this one? So this is a version of Fabris's quarta. This is sort of his most typical version. You'll see that right away, you'll notice that his feet are further apart. I'm going to switch back to seconda now. Seconda, notice how that his feet are closer together. Now quarta, his feet are further apart. And this is a function of changing degrees of profile. Now his arm is also lower in quarta. Notice the height here. Now back to seconda. Arm is higher. We're not really talking about sword work today, but just to show you that those two things are linked. Degrees of profile are also quite different, and what he's doing with the offhand is quite different. So the offhand here is popping back with the elbow, offhand in seconda, popping down. Can you pop down? I don't even know. There are other options, like for example, just to give you a sense of variety, here is an unusual stance for Fabris, which is low terza. And this is one of the rare cases where Fabris will lean back. And he's leaning back because he's dropping his hilt. And he does not want to have his hilt low and his head high. And Thibault would completely agree with that. Well, yes, he would agree with that, but also Thibault would say, then just don't do it. Notice also that his weight is pretty far apart. Or excuse me, his feet are pretty far apart. Okay, so that is... that's a little bit about his stance, which is a lot of this is by way of saying that he has a lot of stances, and the main things they have in common are that they're short and he almost always leans forward with some exceptions. But when it comes to actually moving, this is where it gets a little bit complex because Fabris is going to use two separate footwork modes, plus later on a third. Before that, do we have any questions about just that stance stuff? This is a fine time for it. Okay.
I have a question, but
Sure.
I'm prone to pester people. When you use degrees of profile, when you were talking about Fabris's stance, you were talking about profile with respect to the adversary regarding the fencer's body not coming off the diameter. Is that correct?
Yeah, although they are often connected. For example, if I'm highly square, let's see if I can do this while you can still hear me. My hilt is in front of my shoulder, which means that it's likely going to make sense for me to also take a step to my left. And the reason for that is that, well, it may not be obvious why you want to do that, but you will often, when you take a very extreme amount of squareness in particular, a step offline is often useful because it forces an opponent to make a strong decision about what they want to do. Like, let's actually take a step to the right. If I take a step to the right, then you have to choose. Do you want all this target, this meaty target, or do you want my blade? If you want my blade, you're going to have to cross out of presence. Now, if I go on the other side, I present a different problem. Actually, generally, we don't love that side, so I misspoke at first. So you would often take a step to the right in this case. Now, if I unsquare a little bit, profile a little bit more, that goes away because now you could theoretically play with my sword and still have a target behind it. Keep in mind, this is, depending on the situation, this could be fairly high risk because you're not necessarily protecting yourself as much. Thibault would say, oh God, no, don't do that. Hide behind your hilt. And Fabris would say, yeah, but as soon as you go for this spot, I'm going to do a girata or something like that. Okay, so degrees of profile, they are not necessarily tied to steps off the diameter, but they're often used with that in practice. Okay, let's talk about moving for Fabris. And we're actually going to be setting a foundation for Thibault as well. Fabris has two separate modes. I'm going to use these two terms here, but I'll put them up on screen. Pie fermo and passata or passing. Now, I'll use the English and the Italian interchangeably here. I tend to say pie fermo and pass. It's a little bit, I kind of mix it up. Pie fermo is clearly jargon anyway. So firm foot doesn't really have any obvious meaning right away. So you might as well learn the Italian for it, right? These are our two modes, the firm-footed mode and the passing mode. So let's talk about what is pie fermo or firm-footed footwork. Well, it's named after the idea that when you strike, one foot never moves. That foot is the foot that you're going to recover back onto. So if you imagine lunging and recovering back, for example, that's pie fermo. So like the classical idea. But you don't have to lunge, right? You could also pass forward, right? And keep your other foot forward. It doesn't have to be any particular foot. Although it, you know, this sort of depends who you talk to, but at least for Fabris, I think. And sometimes neither foot moves, right? Both feet can be firm. In that case, you just lean your body. The core idea, though, is that your forward momentum, if you have any, will end as your strike lands, and then generally you're going to reverse directions and reset. That's pie fermo footwork in a nutshell. Now, a lot of these, what I'm saying is not, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's sort of the Socratic ideal. Okay, now the other one, passing. Passata, you could say passare, passata, whatever. My Italian's not too great, but passing footwork. When you strike, both feet move. One foot moves on the strike, and then the other foot moves immediately afterward. That's the general idea. It's like walking. One foot is always coming up off the ground. So your strike doesn't have to involve actually switching your leads on the strike. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the core idea is that you're maintaining your forward momentum after you strike. So these are two different attitudes about momentum. One is about arresting your forward momentum, and the other is about preserving your forward momentum. So let's look at those in detail, because it sounds, if this is all you know, and in particular, if you're really attached to the words pie fermo and passing, pie fermo makes it sound like the most important thing is what happens after you strike. And in a sense, it is, right? It sounds like two different attitudes about recovery, but that's just one part of the story. Because in truth, we can see the difference in every stage of footwork, the stance, what happens before the strike, what happens during the strike, what happens after the strike. And we can set that up just like good Spaniards. Okay, so let's talk about the stance. So what would a good pie fermo stance look like? What would a good passing stance look like? Well, here's just some ideas here. Pie fermo stance might be a little longer. Passing stance might be a little shorter. Pie fermo stance might be ready for more explosive sudden movement. Passing stance might be more ready to step with either foot. So why is that? Well, a short stance is very mobile. It's very versatile. It's easy to step with either foot in most directions. I mean, we looked at this with Thibault's stance, right? A long stance is definitely harder to move in as many directions, but also you have to move less in order to support force. So for example, let's say you're going to run onto my point and I'm going to hit you without moving. Well, that means I'm striking you in the same stance that I'm starting in. In which case, I would want to be starting in a wider stance that can support force and could allow me to lean and adjust my angle. And that would also be an example of striking pie fermo. And in that case, the starting stance we'd want it to be wide. You don't necessarily have to, that's a bit of an extreme example. You could also just step into that, right? You don't necessarily have to begin there. But usually with a long stance, you already know which foot you want to step with next. And if, as opposed to a short stance, tends to be good for reorganizing before accepting force. So if you know you want to reorganize, a short stance gives you more options to do so. And it matters where your weight is on your feet matters a lot less if your feet are close together. So we're going to see that the pie fermo fighting, where you're looking to strike hard and then stop and maybe back up, that tends to be more appropriate for these longer stable stances. And if that isn't my priority, if I just want to keep moving, shorter stances tend to be a good default. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. It's about optimizing. It's not necessarily about setting these black and white rules. Okay, so right away, I want to make it clear. Fabris uses both. Fabris has both modes. Now, he does have some preferred stances, but remember what I just showed you. He had some short stances and he had some long stances. That's because Fabris has both modes. Thibault, however, does not. So we'll get back to that. All right, that's the stance. So what about, let's apply these two footwork modes to what you do before the strike. So before the strike, we can characterize this as approaching. At least that's the offensive side of it. So approaching, let's take a look. So as you approach, pie fermo style approaching, I hope this is easily readable for you guys. Pie fermo style approaching will tend to involve lengthening your stance, then gathering, lengthening, gathering, alternating, and one leg stays forward all the time. Whereas with passing, it's more of a smooth, natural walking step, in which case the lead leg is alternating. Now, probably in practice, most of you are probably used to using both of these at different occasions. But the idea is, like, when would you like to use one? When would you like to use the other? Well, if you wanted to maximize the amount of time both feet are on the ground, you might prefer pie fermo style advancing steps. But if you want to keep one foot off the ground at all times, then you probably revert to more of a regular walking step by passing your feet. And the difference is how they deal with momentum. One of them allows you to stop and reset all the time, and one of them keeps your momentum going. One is about staying stable, neutral, and ready, and the other is about flow and about momentum. And again, this is only loosely correlated with pie fermo and passing. You can freely alternate between these strategies, but you can see how one does seem optimized for one and the other seems optimized for the other. So that's before the strike. So we now have a stance preference, we have an approaching preference. Let's talk about striking during the strike. And again, Fabris uses both of these. During the strike, we can talk about two versions of strike and footwork. Now, right away, I'm going to have to emphasize this a few times. When I say striking on the pass, I don't necessarily mean striking with your left foot forward, but I might, right? That's the most obvious difference. So if you're right-handed and you step with your left foot forward, that is a passing step. And it is, in fact, part of our passing mode. But that's pretty superficial, right? So the passing your feet to strike is a little better suited to passing footwork in general, but the fact that you're switching leads is not really the important part of that. Let's look at what is important. So yeah, pia fermo tends to be associated with stepping with the lead leg, like a lunge. Passing tends to involve switching leads. But more important would be something like the second point, which is that the rear foot is the rear foot might be planted in one and lifting off in the other. Because what are we trying to do? We're trying to think about what is our momentum doing? Are we able to break? Likewise, a pia fermo style strike is likely going to occur with one step. A passing strike may develop over multiple steps, as we saw with Thibault earlier. Now, the breaking is not very important for striking on the pass, but if you're striking with the front leg and hip organized to break, then that allows you to stop your momentum. So, for example, if I step out further with my foot, my front, whichever foot is leading, but let's say it's my front foot. If I take a bigger step, I'm organizing, and especially if I take it early in relation to the rest of my body. So I put my foot out really wide and then come onto it. I'm in a really good situation to break, right? I can break my momentum pretty well. But let's say I take the same degree of incline with my body, but I take a teeny tiny step. Well, now I'm all tilty, right? So that's a little bit more of a passing mentality. So which means that for passing footwork, I can lean really far ahead of my hips, but for pia fermo footwork, it's pretty hard, right? It's a lot more of an athletic a challenge. Let me give you a quick example of this before we go further, because once again, Fabris does both, but he's got a really striking example if you compare him to Capoferro. Little side note, Fabris is often described as more athletic than Capoferro, and I actually think it's completely the opposite. And this is a great example. So these two images. I'm going to zoom in on the, well, actually, we need to see both. So this is a low passing void. The top is Capoferro's plate 11. The bottom is Fabris's plate 8. And what we're going to see here is that, first of all, you should know that how you read this is these two guys, they're not fighting. It's the same guard shown from both sides. This is not a play. Up top is a play. They're doing what is functionally the same thing on a tactical level, but on a biomechanical level, it's completely different. First and most obviously is that Fabris's guy is getting lower, right? So his head is roughly at hip level. Guy on the right's a little bit lower, but it's okay. Whereas for Capoferro, there is a pretty substantial height difference. And why is that? Well, because Capoferro is trying to take his shoulder and his heel and keep them roughly in line with each other. Whereas that is not remotely true for Fabris. Why would Capoferro do that? Well, he wants to break. Or at least he wants the ability to. He might not break, but he wants the ability to break. Now, for Fabris, take a look at where his shoulders are and where his hips are. His shoulders are out ahead of his hips and ahead of his feet. He cannot possibly stop here. And in fact, he doesn't. He says to us that the second step will come out even faster than the first. Meaning that you're going to strike this and then just almost fall into your next step. Now, if you're a classicist, that probably sounds like bad technique. Well, this is Fabrisian footwork treats that as a feature, not a bug. You're going to progress smoothly into the next step. But even Capoferro, another Italian, someone who does sometimes talk about striking on the pass, you can see how he takes the different approach. But keep in mind that it's not just a question of commitment. Fabris isn't spending his commitment for nothing. Let's look at this. Look at the distance between Capoferro's feet. Look at the distance between Fabris's feet. Now look at the height of their heads. The goal here is to get underneath the opponent's blade. Look at the height of the heads of the Fabrisians. Capoferro's low void is strictly limited by how big a step he can take, which makes this highly, highly athletic, right? At least in my opinion. Whereas Fabris can take a nice low step, and as long as he can hinge at the hip, he can get lower. He can't just get lower for the same size of step, he can get lower for a smaller step. And then on top of that, take a look at the rear heel. Capoferro's low pass keeps the rear heel down. It improves his ability to recover back. By the way, this is really hard to do for what he's doing, to keep that heel down. Fabris is like, yeah, no, go ahead, keep it up. Because you're not going to go back anyway. You're going to continue forward. So this is that's the clearest possible example that I can give you of the difference between body shape that the strike entails. So it's the fact that they're striking. I gave you an example where Capoferro's striking with the left foot forward. He is passing, and yet that looks pretty Piafermo to me. So during the strike, we've got these two different modes. There are other things we can talk about during the strike. For example, the size of the step, but I think you get the picture. Let's talk about what happens after the step. I should say after the strike, because the step may be many steps. After the strike, well, this is actually arguably the most important difference. What do we do with all that momentum? So in the Piafermo mentality, generally you're going to break. You might reverse and reset. You're almost certainly going to reset in some way, right? And when you pass, you're going to let your momentum carry you. And that generally that's going to mean forward, although it may be at a different angle. And when you pass, you're generally going to step with your rear foot next. And what are you going to do? Well, most often for Fabris, he's going to escape. But you could also chase an opponent who is backing up, or you can try to grapple. That's also something that both Fabris and Thibault will do. But keep in mind that it's not just that we're not just talking about recovering backward versus recovering forward, because you could recover forward with a Piafermo mentality. You would just gather your feet forward, not change your leads, reset a little bit further forward, which is, again, a very classical friendly idea. So what happens after the strike is the clearest difference between these two tactics. But it's not just about that, because when you think about it, what happened after the strike was just a natural development of what happened during the strike. Because consider, if we took that low voiding pass we just saw Fabris do, this would already be decided for us. And likewise, that step developed out of the approaching footwork, and that approaching footwork developed out of the pass. So the distinction isn't just about how you recover. So, although Piafermo footwork and passing footwork is ostensibly about your feet, the choice really affects the entirety of your body at every stage. And since this section was about how Fabris likes to move, he does all of the above. This is a fine time for questions if you got them. Otherwise, we'll move on. All right. I'll take that as a move on. So Fabris, he does all the above. I would say that for Fabris and his Italian contemporaries and the Germans that follow the Fabrisian school, you have to be able to fight with both of these modes. That being said, we just saw another Italian, Capoferro. I think Fabris is more optimized for passing in general, right? So if someone like Alfieri, well, Alfieri talks about doing both, but maybe he's a bad example. If someone, depending on how you read Capoferro, he might do both. It's debatable. But if he does both, he's clearly a little more on the Piafermo side of things, but where Fabris, I think, is definitely optimized for passing. So I read that as he prefers the passing versions for all of these. So Fabrisian swordsmanship has at least two modes. But there's a third one. And that's called proceeding with resolution, which is the subject of Fabris's second book. Now, proceeding with resolution is just passing footwork and passing tactics with one extra detail. You're going to constantly move forward from the moment you draw your sword. And when you think about it, it's the logical conclusion of preserving your momentum. So if you're passing before the strike, you're passing during the strike, you're passing after the strike, all without stopping, you follow all of that together, you optimize, you get proceeding with resolution. And that's Fabris' signature way of optimizing passing footwork. Now, everything I say today about passing tactics is also going to apply to proceeding with resolution. So for our purposes, we can treat Fabris as if he only has 2 modes, which most Italians only have 2. So I'm going to simplify it just in that sense. Just know that proceeding with resolution has that one extra caveat, which is that you can't do any Piafermo in there. Whereas otherwise you could do a little bit of swapping back and forth. All right. Let's talk about Thibault again. How do these Fabrisian footwork modes apply to Thibault, I wonder? Well, to begin with, Thibault only has 1 mode, right? And so how would we characterize it? In fact, I would say that's pretty normal. I think most of the Destreza guys also only have 1 mode. I mean, it's a little bit unusual to have more than 1 when you think about it. That almost sounds like you've opened up design space to optimize. So think about how Thibault likes to move. We established this earlier. He likes a short stance. He likes to keep 1 foot in the air a lot of the time. He likes to switch leads on the approach. He likes to attack and keep moving forward. He doesn't usually reverse directions. He's able to redirect his body without arresting his momentum, which is what we talked about earlier on the Girard question. And he's generally, I think, more optimizing for smoothness than explosivity. Doesn't that sound like Fabris' passing mode to you? It does to me, right? So if you look at it this way, Fabris is doing 2 modes, but if you just reduced him to just passing, then a lot of the differences between these 2 guys would melt away, in my opinion. And keep in mind, if I say that Thibault is consistent or compatible with passing footwork, that is mutually exclusive with Piafermo footwork, so long as he only has 1 mode. Which is to say, the list of footwork that is associated with Piafermo is essentially a list of what is absent from Thibault's system. All right. Hope that's making sense so far. Let's talk about tactics next. So what makes this discussion interesting to me is that these modes aren't just about moving your feet. And they're not just about body shapes. They are about tactics as well. These are different tactical modes. So if I take an idea like Piafermo, it's not a simple cut and dry concept. If you read Capoferro, you probably think it is because Capoferro presents it that way. But if you read all the others, it doesn't seem cut and dry. It's a cluster of ideas. It's a conceptual cluster about how to stand, how to move, how to strike, how to recover, and about your approach to the fight in general. Same thing with passing, right? So this is why I characterize them as modes. So let's talk about the tactical side. I want to look at 3 elements of tactics. There's probably others we can talk about, but I've highlighted 3. So the first question is, do I want to move first or do I want to move second? The second question is, how do I feel about neutrality? Third, how do I incorporate things like deception and change into my attacks? Each one of these is going to have some connection to the Piafermo and passing distinction that I made. Or at least I will argue that. Okay, let's talk about first mover and second mover, that distinction. So I don't know how commonly this is talked about, but if you read the books, you're going to intuit it over time. There's a common theme in books, especially Italian books. Okay, the enemy attacks, the good guy performs a counterattack action, good guy wins. Good guy is in fact, he doesn't just win, he moves second and wins. So more specifically, he commits second. So let's look at a Fabrisian example because he's got some good ones. How about this one? Plate 31. Here's a classic. All right, the enemy attacks with a thrust and a big step forward. Enemy's on the left. Our hero beats him with a counter action. Now I'm going to tell you what he's doing technically. It's okay if you don't follow this. He's going to drop his sword to quarta into the low line while voiding with, and this is called a mezzocavazione. A mezzocavazione in quarta to the low line while voiding with the girata of the left leg. This is in contratempo, which means that it strikes at the same time that the opponent is attacking. Now, if you didn't understand that, it's okay. The important thing is that the opponent made a big movement and our protagonist reacted. He moved second and he won. The specific details of how he moves is less important here. Except that what are you supposed to take away from this plate? Is it that this is a good technique, right? The mezzocavazione and girata is just a really good technique? Well, maybe. I mean, Fabris loves this. If he has a favorite technique, this might be it. Except that he goes on to defeat it a bunch of times. So how about plate 33? Here's plate 33. Guy on the left is using that technique and just getting absolutely skewered. Or how about plate 34? Plate 34, we have the guy on the right doing the girata, and Thibault is hitting him in the hip. How about plate 39, my personal favorite? He's being intercepted on the low inside line. This is, Fabris actually defeats it over and over and over again. So what am I supposed to take away from this? That you just have to, is it just rock, paper, scissors, right? You just have to guess right? I don't think so. I think instead the difference here between 31 and all the counters to 31 is who moves first. And that shouldn't be too surprising. The idea is that in plate 31, the girata moves first because the opponent, the girata moves second. The opponent commits first. So our hero commits second, so he wins. But in all the other examples, the girata is used first. So the one thing common to all of these is the second mover wins. In this case, it's not really about the technique, is it? I mean, the technique is required, but that's the first level. Then the second level is, the higher level is the timing. Or more specifically, the second mover advantage. So let's talk about that idea of a second mover advantage. So second mover advantage is the advantage of being able to choose your response after it's too late for the opponent to change their mind. So you get to choose your action. And the reason this works is that every action has a counter. This wouldn't work if that wasn't true. So let me give you guys a nice intuitive example. For this next trick, I will need a lovely assistant. Can I grab Puck or Eric, whichever of you is available?
Sure.
Okay, Eric, let's play a game.
Okay.
Let's play a totally normal game of rock, paper, scissors with one change. We're going to take turns and you get to go first. So you might be able to see where this is going. So go ahead, choose.
Because it's not really Rochambeau, it's just Roe now, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
There we go.
What is that? That is a scissors? Oh, you poor, poor fool. I see you've stepped into my trap again. For I have selected rock, the most natural and infallible counter to your most vulgar of techniques. I win. Okay, so what happened there? That's second mover advantage, right? Because I have all the time in the world, and there's nothing that he can do that isn't counterable, right? Because we froze time. So that's how you can experience second mover advantage. In that case, it's completely undefeatable, right? So which means that next time Eric and I should play for money. So if we wanted to balance this out, we could say, okay, maybe I've got a time limit, right? And then you'd have to say, what happens if Eric if Eric does his and then I don't react in time, does he win by default, right? That would be a little bit more like a sword fight. And then you'd have to think about, well, okay, what about reaction speed? So second mover advantage is very real, but it is time dependent. Now, if you'd only ever read Giganti's book, Capoferro's book, or Fabris's first book, you might think that Italians just love second mover advantage. But in Fabris's second book, he explicitly endorses a different option, which is based on first mover advantage. So let's talk about what that is. This one's pretty easy to understand. I attack first. I present my opponent with a problem to solve, and then he has to solve the problem in time or he dies. There you go. So first mover presents the problem. He presents the psychological pressure, and he exploits the fact that your reaction always is going to take time. So as you get closer, you'll experience first mover advantage more strongly. You get closer, attacks take less time, but your reaction speed doesn't get any faster. At a closer range like Fabris's misura stretta, you want to be the one presenting the threat, right? You don't want to be forced to react, and that's first mover advantage in a nutshell. So since we just used rock, paper, scissors, let's think about what is the first mover advantage equivalent. So if second mover is like turn-based rock, paper, scissors, the first mover advantage can be experienced with that slapping game. We call it slapjack when I was growing up, where you put your hands out, one person puts their hands over you, and then you try to slap them, and they try to get out of the way. Generally, the person who gets to move first has an advantage on that, right? Because they got to, because you're so close to each other, and you're so fast that reaction time is really the challenge there. So these seem like contradictory ideas, right? But second mover advantage and first mover advantage do not contradict each other. I think of it as like magnetism. So there's a magnet on my fridge. I'm looking at it right now. So that magnet is held in place by magnetism, but it's also being affected by gravity, which is trying to pull it off, right? So magnetism doesn't turn off gravity, right? But, as the magnet is closer to the fridge, the relative strength of magnetism is stronger. If I pull it off the fridge, it gets relatively weaker, and the distance is what governs who wins out, right? And as it turns out, it's the same is true for second mover advantage and first mover advantage. It's about distance, right? Because the further away you are from each other when someone commits to an attack, the more time someone has to react and to choose the appropriate counter, to reorganize their body to get there. So it gets more dangerous to be the person attacking at longer ranges. But the closer you are, the reverse is true. First mover advantage becomes really strong, really close. So this is probably the most important difference between the two. There's two main distances in Fabrisian swordsmanship: misura larga, misura stretta, and this is probably the main difference between them. Misura larga, you don't really want to be the one moving first. In the examples I gave you before, they were all from misura larga. If you take one step closer, suddenly moving first looks a lot better. And by the way, the way that Fabris describes it, he says you don't even need a tempo to attack a misura stretta. So he says wait, and so like waiting for a tempo, it's a second mover tactic. So if I want to move second, what would I do? I'd probably come to like a long range or a medium range. Then I either just wait or I try to provoke my opponent. If I want to move first, I need to take control, and I need to keep that control as I get closer, and I need to close range with my opponent. It doesn't mean I'm not ready to react second, by the way. Just because I want to move first doesn't mean I'm not ready to move second. But if my opponent doesn't ever attack, then I'm going to gradually get closer and closer until I get to the point where my first mover advantage is stronger than their second mover advantage would be if they were to react. As it happens, this is exactly what Thibault does. And it's exactly what Fabris does in his second book. So they're big fans of first mover advantage, although I did just show you an example of second mover advantage from Fabris's book. So he uses both, of course. Now, as you may have guessed, each of these two advantages, I shouldn't say advantages, each of these two preferences, the preference to be second and the preference to be first, well, they loosely correspond with our two Fabrisian modes of fighting. I would argue that Pia Fermo footwork is pretty well suited to moving second, for example. So think about this. If you want to move second, don't you want to be able to stop and wait for an unknown amount of time? That's pretty good, right? So you need to be able to reset. You need to not maintain your momentum from your previous step. You need to be able to manage your distance really carefully, right? Because you come a little bit too close, then suddenly first mover starts looking a little better, right? And that means that you may not want the, you may be willing to give up smoothness in order to have better braking power. You also are probably more willing to strike at a long range and then back out and do it again. Right? So this idea of almost like a tag mentality where I shoot out and then recover back, I think that's pretty second mover friendly. Again, these are loose correlations. You don't have to do that as second mover, but I think it makes sense to optimize that way. You can, obviously, you can still strike on the pass as a second mover. In fact, we saw a picture of Fabris doing it because Girato, the left foot, is definitely needs to recover forward while maintaining momentum. But you can see how Piafermo footwork is a good tool for moving second. Again, you don't have to, but it's good for it. Conversely, I think for the same reasons, passing footwork is pretty good for moving first. I mean, all the same, the inverse of everything I just said still applies, but in addition, think about this, passing is pretty good for closing ground. Like you're going to use your momentum to cover more ground. Passing steps cover a lot of ground. It helps you get close. You want to be close when you strike first. And you don't, but also, you know, as you step with your left foot, there's a moment where you kind of lose a little bit of your range because your shoulders turn a little bit, or they might, right? You're not maximizing your range. If you're getting close, that doesn't matter as much, right? You don't need to maximize your range. And there's also this middle ground, this dangerous middle ground between sort of a long, medium range and a close range, where you're not quite sure whether you want to be the one moving first. And passing footwork helps you flow through that space pretty quickly, which I think is good. So passing, pretty good for moving first. Piafermo, pretty good for moving second. These aren't rules, but it matters if you want to totally optimize for one or the other approach, right? Optimizing means worrying about the details.
Michael?
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So, in traditional Italian, we have feints, which are done at Piafermo
Mm-hmm.
distance, right? So, is that a way of achieving first mover from the zero larga? I mean, first mover advantage from the zero larga, do you think?
So I think I missed a little bit of that. Are you can you clarify for a second because you cut out
Right.
for a
So,
second.
you mentioned that from a greater distance, that
Mm-hmm.
tends to present a better opportunity for a second mover
Yeah.
plays, right? But when we do feints in a lot of Italian material, we're doing them from that distance. So is
Mm-hmm.
that a way of moving from second mover to first mover?
I would say
or-
that though we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the short answer to that is I think when you're feinting an attack, a lot of times what you're trying to do is actually convince the opponent that you're moving first so that they actually move first. So it depends on what you're trying to elicit partially, because a feint can elicit a parry, or it can elicit a counterattack, or it can elicit a number of other things, right? So if I'm trying to, it's most obvious when you're talking about a counterattack. So let's assume I'm attacking in the hopes of getting you to attack me. Excuse me, I'm feinting to provoke an attack. When that happens, I'm moving first, but I'm not committing first, right? So
right.
I'm trying to get you to commit first, and then I commit second. That's the most cut and dry example. It becomes a little bit more complicated when we consider things like, you know, parries, because a parry is like, it's more committed than some actions, but it's less committed than others. So it's not always cut and dry. But I would say that we'll talk a little bit about deception later on. But in general, I'm going to say that deception is going to be more second mover friendly, at least from a Fabrisian mentality. You know, it could be that that other Italian traditions view it differently. Speaking of which, Fabris has both modes when it comes to second mover and first mover. His whole first book is pretty much all second mover style stuff. His second book is first mover. I know that sounds backwards. First and second, whatever. I suspect that if Fabris, gun to his head, had to choose, he would prefer to move first. I mean, proceeding with resolution, moves first, is based on moving first, and that is his signature tactic. But isn't it interesting that he felt the need to include both? Not just him, many of the other Italians did, like Alfieri, for example. He talks a lot about both. I mean, what that suggests to me is that it implies that there are some opponents in some situations which call for one and some which call for the other. And we all know that there's some people who are aggressive who will come run you down, and some people who won't make you come to them, you know. So that makes sense. Also, there's one problem in particular that Fabris pointed out. If both sides are both trying to be second mover, they're both waiting for a tempo, you get in this ridiculous stalemate. And in that case, you need to know how to break it. One solution to that, by the way, is that you try to solve that problem with deception, right? So you, with feints, invitations, and whatever, and you make yourself more and more vulnerable until the opponent just has to launch themselves at it. It just trying to make it more and more appealing for people to take the shot. Fabris would not like that solution, and neither would Thibault. So Fabris would rather know how to get out of that space into a first mover space. You could say that he's solving the problem with footwork rather than blade work, although that's obviously an oversimplification. What about Thibault? Thibault wants to be a first mover. Like I said, earlier, he's got one mode. He generally wants to be proactive. He doesn't really want to be reactive. I mean, he'll sometimes pose a problem and let his opponent react, but he's not relying on them reacting. He's just he's ready for the reaction. So, for example, let's say he might enter with his blade parallel and underneath his opponent's blade. And that's a way of enticing his opponent to pick a side. But he'll offer that bait, but his feet are also going to set a timer. Because if you don't react in that window, he's still going to move. That's very different from saying, I'm not going to move. My rules say that I must not commit my feet till your feet are moving. No, that's not Thibault, and that's not Fabris's passing mode. Thibault, though, does present us with a unique question of what about when he pauses? What about his weird little pauses with his foot in the air? That seems so odd. Well, I read that as he's presenting a threat. He's starting to move. He's pausing to see if he's getting a reaction. He's basically looking both ways before he crosses the street. But he's still willing to cross the street if nothing happens, and that's the distinction. Of course, he's happy to punish an opponent who does him the favor of committing first, though. And that's important because you can't always be a first mover. No one can. You cannot always be a first mover. So I think a lot of people have this cartoonish idea of Thibault, and perhaps he gains a little bit of this reputation by osmosis from Pacheco. Take a drink, I guess. That he is a bit of an idealist and an ideologue. Because, so you would think he would rail against being reactive. Like, if he's against something, he's usually very against it. Right? I mean, to be fair, he rails against deception. He rails against unnatural postures. He rails against offhand weapons. He rails against overly complex hilts. He rails against the prices at Starbucks. I mean, how much could a double shot espresso macchiato possibly cost to make, right? But you can't be ideologically opposed to second mover tactics. It just doesn't work. So everyone has to be reactive sometimes. I have to move second sometimes because sometimes my opponent's just going to attack. And even if I think they're wrong and dumb for doing so, they still might do it. And if my opponent attacks dumbly and I refuse to move second because for some ideological reason, then I'm just not taking advantage of the opportunities in front of me. And more importantly, it's my job to punish my opponent's mistakes. And if I don't, then they're not mistakes. They were contextually appropriate. And if they're no longer mistakes, then my opponent now has more options. I've just handed my opponent a free set of options. For what? So I can win an award for ideological purity? No. So no one can be completely devoid of second mover tactics. It's just a question of whether you're willing to use first mover tactics or whether it is your preference, right? So Thibault, while he does, so with Fabris, it's easy to say he's got two modes, he'll use both. But Thibault will use both too. It's just that he has a preference. So they both like moving first. Fabris will also move second. And when you think about it, this seems consistent with their footwork preferences because, again, Fabris uses both, but Thibault likes to pass, and passing seems to be good for moving first. Any questions on that second mover, first mover stuff before we move on to the next tactical idea? Okay. So let's talk about neutrality, because our two Italian footwork modes also come with two different attitudes about the value of neutrality. So neutrality, by neutral, I mean something like a medio in Destreza terms. So in terms of stance, for example, a neutral stance might mean something even weighted. In terms of sword position, neutral obviously would mean keeping your sword very central. But in general, neutrality means being ready to move in any direction, or any direction you care about, I suppose. So passing footwork. I think passing footwork is not very neutrality friendly. Passing footwork means maintaining your momentum, right? So, which means I'm not returning to the same position all the time. Instead of always working from the same stance, for example, I'm actually having to operate from a variety of stances. Like I have momentum for my previous steps. And that also means that I don't have total control over which foot is forward at any given time, right? Because it would take a motion to switch that. And if I'm maintaining my momentum, then it's already decided. And assuming my opponent is moving as well, when I get to a certain distance or timing, I may not be able to predict or anticipate which of my feet is going to be forward at that time. It also means my weight's going to alternate between my feet, and that I can't stop easily and I can't reverse easily, although I can change directions probably. So if I use passing mode, it's probably neutrality is simply not a quality that I value very highly. Why don't we take a look at just an example of what that might look at, like, because we haven't looked at a picture in a while. How about, there's so many examples. Let's look at one from Fabris. This is one from Book 2, Rule 6. Okay, we care about the guy on the left. This is our hero. In this case, he's got this fairly extreme version of guardia quarta. His right foot is forward. Then he's going to take his left foot forward. And then his right foot forward again. I'm going to zoom out so we'll see all three. The important part here is that he is not returning to neutral in between these. He's not returning to his basic stance. Nothing like that. It's going 1, 2, 3, and I'm in. And we saw something similar from Thibault. But let me give you it. Fabris has so many examples. Here's another one. Again, Rule 6. Now we care about the guy on the right. So guy on the right foot forward, he's approaching. Now he's got the left foot. He's kind of caught up to his sword in this case. And then he went straight into his attack. The right foot forward. So here Fabris is advocating a style of approaching that is very pass friendly, but you also see it is about the least neutral thing you could do. It's not, he does not return to neutral in between his approaching steps, and he's not going to return to neutral until he's out of measure. Neutrality
is he changing the line of blade engagement also, or is that an option as needed?
It's an option as needed in Rule 6, yeah. In this example, I don't believe he was in that sequence. Part of what he's doing is he's actually putting his sword out first, and this is incidental, putting his sword out first and then catching up to it, which makes it a little bit harder for the opponent to pick a line early. And then all of a sudden he's extending it out. Although actually he's striking with a bent arm in that last one. but he's entirely able to switch sides up until a certain point. And Thibault is very similar in that respect. Although for Thibault, it's interesting because he's also taking these pretty wide angles. So as he gets closer, he'll eventually pick a side and stick with it in a way a little bit more definitively than Fabris, just because he's stepping further from the diameter. So when you're in this passing mode, neutrality is just not what you're conserving. But what about Piafermo? Well, I think you can guess. If the world was firm, then I would ideally approach cautiously, and I'm returning my stance all the time. You know, I'm striking, I'm returning back to that stance, and maybe I'm never spending more than one step away from it, from my whatever my favorite all-purpose neutral stance is. So in this sense, Piafermo mode is like resetting all the time. You know, you take a step, you reset. You take a step, you reset. You strike, you come back, you reset. Or you strike, you come forward, you reset. Right? What is resetting but returning to a neutral? So a lot of this connection to our modes has to do with this first and second mover tactics that we've already talked about. If I want to move second, for example, then I need to react at an unknown time. I need to maximize the amount of time that I'm ready to react, which means I have to come back to a relatively neutral ready position in order to do that. But if I'm moving first, then, well, I get to fight on my own terms, right? Neutrality isn't necessarily that useful when I'm being proactive. But that's good because I can't be ready for everything if I want to be first mover, right? I can't be ready for everything, but I don't have to be ready for everything if I'm the one attacking. Because I create the pressure, I dictate where the opponent has to react, but much more importantly, I dictate when the opponent has to react. I create the window, and if they don't act in that window, the window's closing, which means I only need to be ready to react during that window of time, and only a certain range of options. And if they don't act, I just get to hit them. So that's the different attitude towards neutrality. But it is maybe worth taking a moment to think about, because Destreza spends so much time talking about medios. It's useful to talk about what is neutrality actually good for? Like, why do we value it when we do? And I think the virtue of neutrality is that it splits the difference between all the options that I care about, right? So a simple example, if I don't know whether to protect my left side or my right side, I split the difference and call it a medio, right? I wait in the middle position, which engenders both options. This is useful for reacting, right? And I think a lot of times we hear like a starting stance. When we see a starting stance, we default into something that is able to react. But it's essentially a reactive mentality. And it's not good at applying pressure, because although neutrality gives you a large quantity of options, it does not necessarily give you high quality options. So here's an example. If I'm in the middle, then I haven't closed either line, left or right. That's a trivial example, but you can see quantity versus quality. Because breadth and depth are always mutually exclusive. They always come at the expense of each other. Like if you're ready for everything, then you're less ready for any given thing than if you had made a strong decision. So this is what we're balancing. Do I want to make a strong decision and have fewer, faster, better options? Or do I want as many options as possible? This is what we're asking ourselves at every point in the fight. But before you answer about your preference, remember, you have an opponent and your opponent has a say. So if you have too few options, you can be predicted. And if you can be predicted, you can be constrained. But if your options aren't good enough, well, then that requires a lower level of execution from your opponent. So again, this is a real trade-off. So from that perspective, what is neutrality? But readiness for the widest variety of options, the greatest breadth, the highest quantity of options, right? So why would I maximize quantity over quality? And my answer to that is when I want to react. So how do Fabris and Thibault feel about neutrality? I think it should be clear at this point. They both they're not opposed to it. Thibault likes to start neutral and then immediately leaves it, right? Fabris is a good example of someone who, perhaps more than anybody else, avoids neutrality almost across the board. Like, yeah, he has a Pia Fermo mode, but even then, he's not that neutral. He makes strong decisions, which we can see in his guards, we can see in his footwork. I mean, think about his stance. He starts not just back-weighted, but the most back-weighted of pretty much anybody. And then with every step, he's shifting his weight again. And he's not returning to a middle-weighted stance so that he can decide later. He's deciding now. And at first glance, particularly if you've only read the beginning of each book, Thibault and Fabris seem diametrically opposed on this topic, because Thibault's stance is just all neutral in every way, or at least he presents it that way. And Fabris's stance seems like a study in extremes. But when they're actually moving, I think that they agree very strongly. Because as much as Destreza loves the golden mean, Thibault is not the poster boy for that particular concept. And Thibault actually spends very little time in his ideal neutral stance. Matthew Howden referenced in his lecture the end of chapter 4. We're a little short on time, so I won't pull it out. But Thibault basically says, "Look, there is no stance that's good enough to wait in. Once you're moving, you never return back to neutral. You just move fast, free, neutral, natural, smooth, from position to position." He actually tells us that at the end of chapter 4. And if there's time in the Q&A, I'll pull it out and read it to you. But in general, he's saying in practice, you should flow smoothly from one position to another. You should change your weight with every step that you take. So our attitude about neutrality and footwork is closely tied to, first, our attitudes about whether we want to move first or move second. But that's also tied to our attitudes about Pia Fermo and about passing, which, and again, like Thibault's tactical preference is in line with the passing mode. Okay, pretty consistent that front. Okay, last thing on tactics. I want to talk about deception a little bit and commitment, right? So our footwork modes are also going to affect that. So we're going to affect about, when I attack, do I commit immediately or do I feint? Do I try to change my attack along the way? My answer is going to depend on my mode. But I don't want to talk about feints, right? I want to introduce a different distinction because feinting is ambiguous. That's an annoying term. I'm actually going to borrow a little bit of a modern fencing idea here, which is that I want to distinguish, there's first intention, right? We know that's a simple attack. By the way, Thibault uses that term, doesn't mean the same thing. Ignore how Thibault uses it for now. First intention, simple attack. Second intention, it's a deceptive attack, right? But not something that reacts, it's just deceptive. And then we've got some other possibilities, an attack that changes intention along the way, or an attack that is unresolved in intention or unforeseen, as in an attack with no particular ending in mind. So changing intention means you start with a plan, the plan changes. An unresolved or unforeseen intention is you don't have a plan. You start with a threat, and then you make a decision later. I'm just going to treat those second two together, changing and unresolved, for the sake of today, because that's a very, very subtle difference. But the important distinction is between second intention and everything else. Because second intention, when we say feint, sometimes it's not clear whether we mean second intention. And when I say second intention, I mean it's something that does not involve decision, right? It's more specific than feinting. It's an attack, it threatens one side, or it threatens one attack, it ends with something else, but you did not make your mind up along the way. You had your mind up from the beginning, and then you carried that out. If you change your mind along the way, that's no longer second intention. It's a change. I'm using this language because the word feint is, it really doesn't give us the level of nuance for what I'm about to say, which is that I think an attack in second intention is very Pia Fermo friendly. And passing, especially as a first mover, is better for changing or unresolved intention. Partially is that a passing attack we've established, well, attack in the passing mode often develops an attack over multiple steps, and it's easier to change what you're doing over multiple steps than over one big one. Also, if you're moving first, you're presenting a threat, you're much more likely to have to react to what's happening, right? And, you know, the closer I get to someone, the less that I need second intention to get my opponent moving, because I don't want them moving. I want to move first. Now, there's lots of exceptions to this. Again, there's a loose connection between passing and this sort of intent, but I think it's a good way to optimize by putting them together. Now, compare that to Pia Fermo. Pia Fermo, especially as a second mover, Pia Fermo with second mover, that's, I think, the main time it makes sense to attack in second intention in general. Because attacks in second intention are good to get your opponent to move. It's especially useful when both swordsmen both want to be second mover, neither one is willing to move, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, you're essentially trying to convince your opponent that you're moving first, but really you're moving second. But one of the reasons why I like Pia Fermo tactics here, footwork, is that if I'm in a static, stable stance, I can play timing games, right? I can decide I'm not actually going to go. I can maybe throw out a false attack, but then not follow with a real attack. There's a lot of things I can do with second intention when I'm not in motion forward already, like step after step. I saw a question. There's that also true of invitations. No, I think invitations are going to be a separate category. In particular, invitations are something that's, depending on the concept, a lot more unavoidable than attacking in second intention, because there's always going to be an opening. So everyone always has to deal with it all the time. But good question. Now, how do Fabris and Thibault feel? Well, Fabris, on paper, once again, they seem like they're on opposite sides of the issue of deception, right? And Thibault actually seems pretty orthodox Spanish in this front, I would say, for what I know about the Orthodox Spanish. I mean, Italian swordsmen, famously deceptive, if you ask Spaniards. Of course, to be fair, you shouldn't ask the Italians because they'll just lie about it. But Thibault hates feints, right? I mean, but really what he hates is second intention. Fabris puts up with feints. It's a little unclear how he feels about second intention. But yeah, Destreza guy hates feints, Italian likes feints, 'twas ever thus. It is a different story, though, when we introduce the distinction between second intention and everything else. Fabris's opinions on this topic are a little complex. I'll spare you all the details. I'll just say in book one, he feints a lot, but there's an open question about whether those attacks are in second intention. But this is also when he's using a lot of Pia Fermo tactics. In book two, when he's using passing footwork with, his proceeding with resolution, he doesn't really deceive people. He has real openings, right? And he exploits that, like not necessarily intentional invitations, but real openings. But he's not really doing any attacks of second intention when he's in his full-on passing mode. In book two, Fabris develops all of his attacks in this very fluid, changeable way, right? And all of his threats are genuine. And that puts him and Thibault actually on the same side of this, because Thibault, while he does hate second intention, Thibault is entirely willing to change his attacks mid-course. Now, Thibault is going to be the kind of guy who's like, why would you need to be deceptive? Just have positional superiority, man. Very Spanish, right? But think about this. He's planning his footwork around the idea of changing his mind. That's why he's pausing with his foot in the air. He's pausing in case he needs to change, right? So he's not just doing first intention all the time. So he's actually extremely malleable. He just doesn't consider it a feint because it's not deceptive, but it is reactive. So once again, Thibault's position makes sense because you can't ever avoid changing intent, right? You can't always attack in first intention for exactly the same reasons I gave earlier about why you can't always move first. You got to be able to punish mistakes. So the Pia Fermo mode, a little more friendly to attacks in the second intention. The passing mode, a little more friendly to attacks that mutate as they approach smoothly into a close range. And yet again, Thibault's preferences put him on the passing side. Okay, so let's put these tactics all on one page. Here we go. We started by talking about footwork. More specifically, we were talking about the direction of the recovery after striking, but really we're talking about tactics. We're talking about three things. We're talking about, do I want to take the initiative, or do I want to react and punish? Do I want to keep resetting to a static neutral position, or do I want to flow smoothly and maintain my forward momentum? And finally, do I want to use deception, or do I want to rely on real attacks that are able to change? Now, each of these choices, which you can see on screen here, each of these choices is correlated loosely. It's loosely correlated with either Pia Fermo movement or passing movement. And in every one of these cases, Thibault's preference has been aligned with the Italian passing mode. So not just shapes, not just movement, but tactics. So let's wrap it up here. What did we learn here today? So first of all, the first thing is that I hope you can see that the Italian distinction between passing modes and Pia Fermo modes, it's powerful, right? Because it starts as a discussion about recovery footwork, but it's really a cluster of ideas which extends to stances, striking footwork, approaching footwork, body shapes, tactics, and it touches nearly every core aspect of swordsmanship. And I would be remiss not to remind you that this is not a Fabrisian distinction specifically. It's actually quite common among 17th century Italian swordsmen, even the ones who don't use both. They will often explain why they're choosing one or the other. Capoferro might be an example of that, for example. Second, when Fabris is in his passing mode, I think we can see that he and Thibault agree on way more than most people would think. They agree on most footwork and most tactics, if Thibault is in his passing mode. Third, and this is the last thing I have to say, Thibault and Fabris are actually, I think, more similar to each other than either one of them is to, for example, classical Italian fencing or anything like that. Right? I think they actually have more in common with each other there. And this is one of the reasons I think why these two authors, they confuse a lot of students, because there are a lot of instructors out there who they're imitating classical fencing in the foundational material that they give to new students. You know, they're either actually teaching classical fencing outright as a foundation, or they're using the pedagogy as a model and they're swapping out specific techniques. But that classical fencing foundation, well, I would argue that what I've given you here today suggests that it's largely in line with the Pia Fermo side of what we've seen today. Or at least if we're using Fabrisian terms. Hey, look, I'm using 17th century imperialism on the 20th century reversal. Now, if you're learning Fabrisian swordsmanship and you've got that kind of background, that only gives you access to half the system. And even that half, I mean, if you wanted to just do Pia Fermo, Salvator Fabris is a weird choice because he doesn't really seem that he's totally optimized for it. And the places where Fabris stops making sense to classicists seem to be the same places where Fabris abandons Pia Fermo, which are exactly the points where Fabris and Thibault overlap. Which means that it's actually worse if you're coming to Thibault's swordsmanship with nothing but Pia Fermo in your head, right? Because as I've argued, Thibault's system is almost entirely devoid of Pia Fermo movement and tactics. And if the classical side is sort of more on the Pia Fermo side, you can see they'd almost seem mutually exclusive. That's obviously a simplification. Anyway, that new student, like, if they've only seen Pia Fermo stuff, might be bewildered by what Thibault and Fabris are doing, or, well, Fabris in his second book specifically, and Thibault in general. And I say that because I've been that student. So, as a recovering confused person, I have found that Fabris and his contemporaries, they give us useful language for understanding what Thibault is doing. And that label, that Pia Fermo label, it's increasingly useful to me because it lets me put a name to all the quote-unquote normal stuff that Thibault isn't doing. And it's also a good label for style of tactics that is really common, even in some parts of the community, overrepresented. And in that mode, that Pia Fermo mode, Fabris trains us to identify that. And he trains us to identify not just the footwork, but the tactics as well. And then he shows us an alternative. And this is the critical part. He doesn't replace it. He shows us how we can fight either with or without it, depending on the situation. And that is how Fabrisian swordsmanship has improved my understanding of Thibault's art. That is all I've got to say. Sorry, we went a little bit long, but thanks for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. You may not know it, but we've had a running side chat where we're
I couldn't
comparing.
see it.
I know, it's a secret chat.
Oh,
But
now I see it. Oh.
we've got sort of a running joke where we ask a question about a commetimiento, but which is that dynamic attack. But you talked about that so effectively. We were all just sort of reorganizing our thoughts on the fly as we listened to you talk about it.
Interesting.
So really, really great to hear your thoughts on that. Really interesting. So I have asked plenty of questions. I want to open this up for people from our audience to ask questions. So we have 21 people. So maybe type your questions into the chat, and Eric and I will pick them up.
All right, I'd be happy to stick around as long as there are questions. I've also got a lot of pictures just around if anyone wants to just see more stuff.
All right, questions are starting to come in. So do you have a feel whether traditional Destreza authors are more passing or Pia Fermo, like Pacheco, for example?
So I was thinking about this. The first thing that I should acknowledge is that this is a foreign concept to Destreza. Not that any of this specific movement is, but the distinction is foreign. And I found that it works for Thibault. I don't necessarily know that it's going to map as well to the others. Let me give you an example of how it won't work. So Pacheco does this thing. So we talked about how your recovery is going to be one of the things that varies, right? So Pia Fermo, you're going to tend like a classic Pia Fermo lunge, recover back. Classic passing, pass, and then keep going. Well, what would Pacheco do? A lot of times what he does is he'll strike, gather his feet forward, and then recover at an angle on a new diameter, right? Which is that? It's neither, right? That's something else. But my read of that is more Pia Fermo. Just, it would depend to me. Here's how I would read it. Are they conserving their momentum? Because there's a way of doing that that involves conserving your momentum. I don't know that that would be the most faithful reading of the text, though. Part of my challenge, really the community's challenge, is that it's hard to see the interpretation that has been missed, right? So if everything looks Pia Fermo, for example, is that because it is, or is it because that's everybody's previous background? You know, I say that not because it's necessarily the case in Destreza, but I think it's very much been the case for Fabris, where a lot of people are really, really hesitant to actually do what he's calling for, particularly in book 2. Like, if you think how many people are actually doing his book 2 tactics, it is a short list. Because people don't want to leave their comfort zones, and a lot of times their comfort zone is more Pia Fermo side. Now, so for Destreza, though, I sometimes get comments about if I'm practicing Thibault's system about the way I deal with momentum, which suggests that they're not learning to deal with momentum that way. So for what that's worth.
So I have a question. We have questions from the audience, but I want to get some clarity on one of the things that you said, just to make sure that I understand it. So Thibault, he sort of flows past. That preservation of momentum is forward momentum. And Pacheco, when he strikes, he tends to bounce off people or
Yeah.
redirect at right angles. Is that what you're talking about as far as conservation of momentum, where he sort of impacts and bounces away?
I think if you're talking about reversing 180 degrees, that's much more Pia Fermo. When you're sort of bouncing at a different angle, I think it would have to be a pretty shallow angle for it to be more passing. But obviously, this is a different. Obviously, it doesn't fit. You know, it's just a framework that doesn't apply to Pacheco. But I would say it sounds closer to the Pia Fermo side. That being said, I've seen people do it with some speed, including yourself, right? In which case you're not necessarily, you could be flowing pretty smoothly through that, right? So I'm not necessarily, I don't necessarily think that for Pacheco it's going to be he's going to clearly land on one or the other. But that being said, I think there's more people doing it in a more stop and start way, just in terms of the current practitioners. That might be reflective of their drilling behavior, though.
I think,
Some
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think of a lot of people are doing something a little bit different as they're setting up to come into distance.
Yeah.
Compared to once they get into distance, right? So if we look in a lot of Spanish fencers are going to move around a lot, and they're going to be moving a lot more fluidly while they're trying to figure out how and when they're going to go in. And then it starts to kind of collapse into, kind of not one or the other. Whereas a lot of the Italian fencers that I've watched, they're fairly static, right? They kind of come distance and then they're like playing around with some positioning, but they're not really using footwork very much. And I can't always tell if that's just the way that like a lot of the community has gone to doing that, or if that's something that's a little bit more
I'd agree with that.
valid read on historical texts.
I mean, and to be fair, like on the Italian side, you can read, like, I don't think it'd be unheard of to see like someone practicing pretty faithfully to Capoferro's book, but also passing on the way in, right? That's why I say they're loose correlations. But if you were to completely optimize hard for one extreme to the other, then it starts to be more black and white. That being said, I think you're right that a lot of Destreza practitioners will be pretty fluid on the way in, right? So in that sense, Destreza is pretty good about having you swap your feet a lot in a way that a lot of the Italians aren't. And in that sense, I think the approaching footwork is much more passing friendly, and also shorter stances, at least compared to, say, Capoferro Giganti, maybe Alfieri, guys like these.
I really did like what you said about we can't see the interpretation that we haven't done yet. And one of the things I think that Ton's footwork has unlocked.
Oh yeah, he's a great example.
Right, he's one of those people that once we fenced against him, because I think I've been guilty of that Pia Fermo footwork, at least in teaching, more often than not, and bouncing off of him as an influence. We have retuned our footwork to be much more fluid.
Yeah, and Tone's movement has this quality where he often leads with his shoulders in sort of this kind of somewhat tippy way, which tells you he's playing momentum games. And I like it. I think it's really interesting. I have no opinion about it as an interpretation, but just having seen the guy, I think he's got something there that's very interesting. But it's not Pia Fermo friendly. Excuse me.
So got another question about Fabris this time. Does Fabris give any guidelines about when you use either mode over the other?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't give enough, right? He gives you a lot of tools. He doesn't give you great information about when to use each. One thing I think is the distance game. Like, I think if you find yourself unable to get close, I think it's pretty obvious that second mover advantage becomes important, in which case pied fermo style strikes are important. But actually, there are other authors who might do this better. Like Alfieri actually does tell us something about when to use each tactic according to some of the qualities of your opponent. So Alfieri talks a lot about what if your opponent's tall, what if they're short, what if they're timid, what if they're choleric, what if they are he uses a lot of old-fashioned words based on humors, but essentially, are they confident? Are they phlegmatic? Which I don't think we need to necessarily put too much weight on Alfieri's specific conclusions, except to say that it is going to be personality dependent on a certain level. So I'll give you an example. If your opponent wants to bear down on you, you're either going to need to beat him at his own game, or set yourself and be ready to move second, right? So which you can do is not something Fabris can really tell you, right? Because that's more about you and the person in front of you. So if someone's bearing down on me, I'm 5'11", there's a decent chance I can hit them before they can hit me, right? But if they're 6'2", right? No, it's probably not going to happen, right? So like the height differential is part of that. There's other factors that if someone's bearing down on me, but I can tell they're timid, I'm going to bear down on them, right? So there's a lot of factors, and I actually kind of respect the fact that Fabris doesn't give us a ton of answers to this, because I think it is so matchup dependent, if I can use a sports phrase. I do appreciate that Fabris does not seem to be of the opinion that we can always do one or always the other. In that sense, Thibault is perhaps a little, maybe that's hubris, right? Thibault is like, yeah, I got a hammer and everything's a nail.
Okay, I have another question here. It's a comment about Thibault fencing in the community today, with a request for input. So the questioner says, I've spoken and practiced with some exclusively Thibault practitioners who move and step stiffly, almost stepping like Frankenstein, perhaps due to the early part of the book where he breaks down, picking up and putting down steps with the back foot lifted second. In the later plates, he does not look stiff, which speaks to your point. What would you say to these practitioners who are Franken Destreza-ing?
They're drilling a lot, right? These are people who I view that as a coaching problem, right? So they're just they're not learning how to. They're treating everything like a drill, I'd say. I mentioned this earlier, the end of chapter 4, Thibault's book. Why don't I just give it to you in Thibault's words, right? So when it comes to practice, well, I would have our student abandon all this, and by this he means static positions. I would have our student abandon all this and hold as far as he can the same countenance and appearance as though he were attacking, whether the enemy holds himself still or advances or moves the sword about. And here's the important part. Let him continue always to move, using a free and natural pace toward one or the other sides, avoiding, above all, the line of the diameter, etc., etc. So Thibault is saying that, and there's other points where he sort of alludes to the fact that this is overly static in this scenario. But Thibault himself says, look, when you're moving, this isn't a drill. You need to keep it going. So when I see people who are sort of Frankensteinian, it's, you see that in every tradition. And in particular, when I see someone who's only doing that, there's a good chance that they don't have a lot of martial arts experience, so they haven't been through this before with something else. And often it means that their coach is just giving them something that is very reflective of maybe how Thibault wrote. Thibault wrote in an argumentative style. It is not a good teaching style. If you just read the book and repeat that to students, you are doing them a disservice most of the time. You can't just say like you can't be an ideologue about everything. You need to have people take ownership over the decisions that they've made. So if you're just saying like this is a solution, the solution I've given you will solve all problems. Well, it might, but only if you're able to see how you personally can flow out of that to address all manner of problems that may arise, to actually own those solutions. So for Thibault, or anybody, like, let me give you an Italian example. And the Italians, a lot of students, they learn drills where they let themselves reset every single time, right? They expect there's going to be one motion. The drills always have a first mover and a second mover, and often the second mover wins, particularly if you're pulling it straight out of the book, which a lot of people like to do. So it's going to instill that second mover mentality. So a lot of beginning Italian students have the same problem, the Frankensteinian thing. Now, it doesn't look like Frankenstein because they're not standing up the same way, but they're just as stiff. They're just as not reactive. They're just as married to a technique. And that's just a stage you go through, right? You do need to flow through these things. Even in a PFRMO mode, you can't treat sparring like a drill.
Isn't that true kind of from everything, right? Where an awful lot of people are, obsessive or even fetishistic about technique and thinking that will produce the results they want, rather than looking for the results and providing technique as a way to achieve them.
And I would like to posit this to the coaches around, any coaches listening or watching. This is not the student's fault. I mean, it's their mistake, but it's not their fault. This is, students are first and foremost, what they're learning first and foremost is how to be a martial arts student in the environment that they're in. So if they're developing the tendency to be perfectionists, that's because the training environment that you as the coach have created is forcing them to become that way, or at least incentivizing them.
I think that's really helpful. I really did like where you went with this lecture. I sort of hate you a little bit now because we're all sort of trapped in this. And the place I think this needs to go, I would really love to see a physical class where you take people through both sides of this, because I think there's a lot there that we could. I mean, so one of the questioners identified an issue in the community, right? And I think just addressing that up front with both the Italian and Spanish sides of this question, I think that'd be a really interesting physical class. So, gosh, if we ever do host an event, I may have to ask you to teach it.
I mean, that'd be interesting. I will say that I've been doing a lot of online coaching these days. Small group, I have a small practice group based in Seattle. I guess it doesn't matter that it's based in Seattle. You want to come, you're welcome to. It's all free. But the reason I'm talking about this is that we're all footwork all the time now.
Right.
I mean, it's no opponent, right? I'm doing it in the very same room that I'm in now, a couple times a week. It's interesting though, if that, I think that, I don't know if that's the sort of thing we need to wait till the after times to do, maybe.
I think so, because I would like to hit someone.
That being said, I trained with Matthew Howden. I do think that he's got a better grasp of Thibault's system than I do. And I think maybe that's, I also don't want to think maybe this is one where we'd have to bring his input in as well.
That sounds even worse now, just terrible.
Although I'm sure the Fabrisian stuff isn't up his alley. By the way, since I brought it up, if you're interested in Fabris and you want to do some remote training, shoot me an email, seattlerapier@gmail.com. Well, we just have a couple people training here, and it's been pretty good. You don't really need anything. You don't even need a weapon, just some space to move.
I will make sure to put a link to that in the YouTube video when I post it.
Yeah, I mean, it's all not for profit, so it's not, we don't need to promote it. It's just if people are interested.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, it looks like we have handled all the questions. So I just really want to thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. It was really, really interesting, and I think you dive pretty deep on some stuff that we chew on a regular basis. So I personally got a lot out of it. We do not have a scheduled next speaker, but we're going to try to get Michael back for part 2. And just everybody stay safe, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.